Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Speaking Frankly, where we feature honest talk with thought leaders across the entire advertising ecosystem and beyond. I am Kym Frank, your host and Geopath president. So today I am super excited to be joined by my friend Mike Bloxham. He is the SVP of Global Media and Entertainment at Magid. So Mike is an innovator, he is a disruptor, and he is also the most passionate foodie that I personally know. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mike.
My very great pleasure. Happy to be here.
So since I know you, but everyone doesn't, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your expertise and your career?
Sure. By all means, as you say, I like food, but let's leave that aside. It's got nothing to do with it. I have spent an embarrassing amount of years working in the consulting and research space, particularly with an emphasis upon consumer insight and media, understanding what it is that drives adoption or inhibits adoption of different media propositions, particularly emerging media propositions, and how they fit together in the overall media landscape and how consumers engage or don't engage and why and so forth. And then feeding into all the different questions that sort of fit within the business cycle around those kinds of things, for everything from TV and movies through online businesses, e-commerce, mobile, et cetera, et cetera. And because I'm very old, I've been doing this for quite a long time, and it means I've kind of got my hands into just about every aspect of media and marketing over the years as well.
It's funny because I was thinking this morning about, I was like, when did Mike and I first meet? And I think it was probably over 10 years ago while you were at Touchpoints, which is something that I think a lot of our members would be familiar with because we, I think, still use some of the data from the Touchpoint studies.
Yeah, it could be when I was with MBI working on Touchpoints. Certainly that was an interesting time. I mean, I think you and I may have actually met a little bit before that when I was at Ball State University, which actually is what brought me over from the UK, doing these large-scale observational studies where we would shadow people for entire days at a time, logging all their particularly their media behavior in 10-second increments. And I think you were one of the people on the agency side at that time that picked up on
Very well could be.
But yeah, we go
Wonderful.
back.
So, so tell me about Magid and what Magid does as an organization.
Sure. Well, Magid goes back even further. In fact, Magid goes back even further than me. A lot of people don't realize the company is over 60 years in existence doing its thing. The company is essentially, it's a combination of consulting and research. And the consulting is always evidence-based because it's based upon the research. And we're best known and primarily work in the media space, but also work in brand space and with retailers and others. But we work in national and international media and in local media as well, which is where the company really was based originally. But rather like my own career, as I described it, we work across the spectrum of media, understanding what is actually going to drive business growth, what's going to drive consumer engagement in all sorts of different parts of the commercial model around media. Which is actually what makes it really interesting, because it's not that we just do TV or we just do online. I have the luxury of working across an incredibly varied array of projects with all sorts of different clients addressing different business issues. And it means that I can draw on expertise across the company, as well as my own experience, to inform our approach to it and our interpretation of findings and how we build perspectives for our clients to help them succeed. So it's kind of a huge sandpit that means we get to play with some really interesting but really important issues within the media space. And as I say, I think the stuff that turns me on the most in the space and with Magid is that I get to have a hand in some projects that can be really consequential for how companies evolve going forward. And that appeals to the not so inner megalomaniac within me.
Well, I imagine this has been a time where Magid has had a lot of really interesting projects going on, given all that's changing as a result of the pandemic.
Well, yeah, I mean, like everybody, we've had to pivot in the context of the pandemic, and we've had to pivot to be able to help our clients as they've been pivoting, and trying to get to grips with what it means for them and how they have to operate both in the near term, and as they try to define a future going forward, which is characterized obviously right now by a huge amount of uncertainty. So we were doing a lot in the early phases of the pandemic, which was very much focused about the pandemic and about the situation at the time, understanding consumer attitudes, behaviors, concerns, what that meant for different businesses that were within our client base, and trying to project forward what different scenarios may play out to be and what they may mean for different clients. Now, I think one of the things that's changed, and I think a lot of people are seeing this, is as we've progressed to where we are now, both in terms of the time of the year and the situation vis-a-vis the pandemic, companies are realizing that you can't sort of stop and kind of hold your breath as much as possible. You've actually still got to find a way to do business. And there's a lot more activity suddenly, which isn't about the pandemic. It's about succeeding in the context and building for the future as much as you can in this period of uncertainty. So yeah, it's been interesting. There's been that period where it was all about the pandemic, and now it's back to not business as normal. We're nowhere near business as normal, but it's trying to go beyond surviving and actually finding a way to somehow thrive is the underlying agenda for the stuff we're doing these days, I would say.
So I imagine that the pandemic has had a lot of impact on the way consumers view television, on the way that they consume different media types. What kind of trends are you seeing that may not go away in the long term, that may have really drastically altered consumers' consumption of media?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's been widely reported that pretty much as soon as the lockdown had happened, predictably, massive spike in TV viewing, both linear and streaming, huge upticks in gaming, in all sorts of online activity and all sorts of other behaviors. And some newer ones started to emerge. One of the things we're doing it now, video chatting, suddenly became a thing, and not just for business either. That was a really interesting thing to see, that was among the behaviors that increased the most in the early phases of the pandemic, and it's kind of stayed there as well. It hasn't tailed off for obvious reasons. We're not kind of popping around each other's houses, so we've got to find another way to feel like we're socializing. Streaming is possibly the most obviously interesting area right now. The pandemic has done one thing across pretty much all areas of the media. It's accelerated the changes that were already happening. I don't think there are many changes that have come about purely as a result of the pandemic. What they have done is crystallize thinking or heighten the necessity for change in certain areas, particularly when revenues have dropped off in more traditional areas. So businesses have been innovating faster, and in some cases, consumers have been responding perhaps faster and more immediately than they would have done otherwise. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge amount going on in streaming with new services like Disney Plus, Peacock, HBO Max, and so forth, joining the other big players. We've got Discovery coming with their offering. It's in the public domain that HBO Max is launching an ad-supported model sometime next year. So it's just continuing to go. But the amount of time spent with streaming services has definitely increased, and that's having a big impact across the landscape now. And it's really interesting, I think, as an indicator that we're seeing major reorgs going on, not just reorgs, but restructuring going on, root and branch restructuring going on at some major players like Disney, like Warner Media, AT&T, all of that, and NBCU, Comcast. Huge restructuring, so that they're breaking down the silos that are really previously defined those businesses, so that it's really about not content for movie theaters, content for TV and so on. It's just content for wherever it can best be monetized as the starting point. And that is new. And I think that's come about more rapidly as a result of the pandemic. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's great. I think you referred to this when we spoke earlier as streaming 2.0. That we've been used to streaming for a while, but now it's changing. What are some of the changes you see in the way that content is delivered and interactivity and things along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, streaming 2.0 is something I've talked about for a while, written about a little bit. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're starting to see the early signs of what I call streaming 2.0. If you think about streaming right now, it's pretty straightforward. The premise is easy and it's fairly one-dimensional. Not that that's a bad thing. You know, it's you can watch a piece of content that you're interested in watching. You can watch it when you want to watch it, and you can watch it on pretty much any platform you want. If you've enabled those platforms for your Netflix, your Amazons, your Peacocks, whatever. And that's great. That's the central underpinning premise that we all talked about for years that interactivity enabled. But it's only one dimension. And one of the challenges that all streaming services have is not only acquisition of subscribers, but then retention. And there are large numbers of people, as we know, that churn out of services on a regular basis. They kind of curate their streaming experience. Some people come in for one particular series, watch the series, they're gone. And we track this all the time. You know, for the last few years now, we've been asking the question, when you subscribe to a service, do you intend to still be subscribing to that service 3 months later, 6 months later, 9 months later, and so on? And it's kind of alarming to see how many people have no intention of still subscribing to the service 6 months out. And that's not just young people, you know, it's not just the Gen Z and the younger millennials. That applies to a lesser extent, but it still applies significantly to boomers as well. So they're curating their experience. Streaming 2.0 has to address that and a number of other things. And I think you're going to see, we are starting to see different kinds of membership packages. Disney Plus did it really well when they launched. The deal with Verizon, which, okay, if you're a Verizon customer, tie you in, you're in for a year. Then HBO Max did a similar sort of thing with multi-year bundles, give you the proposition, they tie you in for a period of time. I think you're going to see a lot more going on in terms of what in any other realm we just call cross-promotional deals. It's not innovative in marketing terms, but it's very innovative in terms of streaming, where there are off-air benefits to me as a subscriber because I am a subscriber. So basically, if I decide to churn out of that service, I have something to lose. And that could be tie-ins with any number of different types of organizations, everything from, you know, retailers through to, when we're back to traveling, you could tie it in with airlines, you could tie it in with car rentals. Basically, think loyalty program. I don't know that it's going to look quite like a loyalty program, but the components of a loyalty program could come to bear on streaming membership to make that subscription more multidimensional and, frankly, to put more hooks, frankly, if you'll pardon the pun, put more hooks into the membership offering so that I have more reasons to stick with this platform than the amount of content that might be available to me that I'm actually interested in.
So does that content change? Does it become shorter, longer series, more dynamic?
Well, that's another angle of what I think about as streaming 2.0. You know, right now we followed a very televisual model. I mean, obviously a huge amount of the content that's on the streaming platforms was originally made for TV, and Netflix, without the world of linear television, would be a pretty paltry offering. They rely really heavily on great series from great networks, and they rely on movies from the libraries and so forth. They couldn't survive with their originals alone, no way, even with their preposterous content budget. So I think you're going to see more of that kind of, you know, traditional Hollywood content is definitely going to be produced. I think you're going to see more short form coming to the platform. You have to. And short form takes up so much time and attention for so many people, not just young people. Everybody uses short form content in one form or another. And it's interesting, not only are you seeing increasingly, you know, yet more and more time is spent with short form content. Our research and everybody else's research shows that people value short form content. We actually asked questions of Gen Z and other generations recently about, you know, how do you value content, short form content relative to long form content? And very large percentages of every generational cohort actually value short form more than long form, which goes completely against the conventional wisdom in Hollywood. They also have issues of quality. They perceive quality to exist in short form, and yet it doesn't represent the kind of Hollywood production quality as defined. That it doesn't have the budgets, doesn't have celebrity. I mean, hell, huge amounts of short form content don't even have any regard or any respect for conventional structures and narrative arcs that define content in the world of Hollywood. So it is completely different, yet it's incredibly resonant. And I think we've already seen with Disney. Disney is starting to promote some of their shorts onto the platform, but I think it's going to get much more diverse, much more broadly defined in the terms of the content that's coming through. The big challenge for getting more meaningful and resonant short form content onto streaming platforms is that Hollywood hasn't got its head around short form. Not a single studio has a division devoted to short form content. There was a time when none of them had a division devoted to TV. You know, TV was the kind of the ugly stepchild and we didn't want anything to do with it. I think we're going to see the same sort of movement. Now TV is central and essential. It throws off huge profits. They haven't yet worked out how to approach and make short form profitable. Quibi, which obviously recently closed, is, I think, the early example of Hollywood trying to get to grips with short form. It basically took all of its conventional thinking about what constitutes quality and will drive audience and pushed it into shorter formats. That didn't work. I think it's going to be seen as a step along the path that Hollywood takes to work out how to engage with Hollywood. It wasn't a bad idea. It wasn't the right idea. The underlying principle was good. So yes, to your point, we're going to see a lot of short form, and we're going to see interaction and interactivity come onto the platforms as well.
So what kind of interactivity? What does that look like?
Well, that is interesting. I think you're going to see elements of gaming coming in. You're inevitably going to see stuff around choose your own ending. We saw that with Bandersnatch last year. That's not a new idea. It's been around in the space forever. But it was interesting that it got onto a streaming platform and was largely regarded as successful. So we're inevitably going to see more of that. I think one of the most interesting forms of interactivity is going to be transactional capabilities. Mm-hmm. You know, we can call it e-commerce if you like it. For a while back in the days of interactivity, it was called T-commerce because it was TV. But transactional video is going to become more the norm. We've already seen it this year. This is one of the things that was accelerated by the effect of the pandemic. NBC launched their checkout service, whereby they're engaging brands and retailers into different sort of promotions that can be leveraged to make TV shoppable in effect. And they've been doing some very interesting stuff that I can recommend someone you should interview about that. You've got Curate, who own QVC HSN. They're already active in the streaming space. I'm certain you're going to see more there. And then going out of the traditional TV world, Facebook obviously launched Facebook Shops this year, post the launch of the pandemic. Launched the pandemic? Start of the pandemic. Yeah, we're not going to go there. And you've got Snapchat and others who are doing increasingly transactionally based interactive promos and campaigns with major brands. So you're definitely going to see a lot more of that. And I think one of the interesting things is that effectively shortens the distance and increases the accountability between an exposure to an ad or a commercial message from a brand to a sale or to some other measure that they care about. Because they're going to be able to say this many people were exposed to that message at these times. This many people responded in these ways, and that led to this many sales. And that's going to be very, very easy to quantify. And that's going to bring a whole other layer of accountability to big screen advertising.
Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of takes me down another pathway, which is maybe a twofold question is, you know, one is what is the impact of this on linear TV? And then two is what is the impact on how we measure that, you know, very diverse, fragmented ecosystem where there has not been a measurement system before. Yeah. So I'm not sure in which order you want to answer those, but I think they're both kind of tied into what you've just brought up.
God, how many days have you got? I mean, these are huge subjects, as it all is. We should be doing this over lunch. That's the way we would normally discuss this. All right, advertising. Yeah, I think. Advertising / linear TV, and how this impacts advertising will majorly impact linear TV, of course. And I think one interesting thing to bear in mind as you come at this is that TV still, for the most part, is still the most primitive screen available to the consumer. You know, in terms of its importance, in terms of its share of money spent around video content, obviously it totally dominates. And yet, when you put it alongside what you do with your phone, what you do with your computer, all you do is watch. You know, there are a few little examples around the edge of doing something other than watching, but that's it. And there's so much more potential, especially now we have connected TVs and you have the back channel capabilities. And that's what is going to make the difference, I think, in this space, whether it's about transactional offerings or other forms of interaction. I think inevitably, and we're seeing it happen already, linear TV is going to become streaming TV. I don't know that linear as defined is going to completely go away. That we still have people using aerials instead of cable or satellite, and perfectly legit. They get decent service from broadcast and some of the other nets. But we're not going to see it completely go away. I do not believe, however, that sport and news is forever going to support the traditional cable bundle. That's all about rights. And when live streaming becomes much more the norm, and it's moving that way, you're going to see some very big players start bidding on the rights when they become available for major sports. And those players have hugely deep pockets. They're called Google, they're called Amazon. Netflix is relatively small by comparison, but those people have deep pockets and they're already playing around with it. The NFL has already been experimenting with some of the streaming that can be done. So I think you're going to see it move there. The live streaming capabilities will mean it's as good as seeing live on TV. And everybody is working out, how do we engage with streaming? At the end of the day, a lot of the content won't change, obviously, because this is just another means of distribution that at its core. The measurement question is a really interesting one, and it's obviously been difficult to grapple with so far. I think, you know, we're not looking at a future where everybody says, oh yeah, Nielsen. Nielsen's not going away. Nielsen's in a position and it's smart enough and nimble enough, it will adapt. Nimble, obviously, I know is not a word typically associated with Nielsen, but you know, they're the super tanker that needs to turn. They've got other little boats as well, which they use to address smaller issues. But you know, they're getting as good a handle as anybody on the streaming area for the most part thus far. Not perfect, but they're getting there. But I think all those other types of measures that we're going to see and that we have seen where people are putting together their own data platforms to provide advertisers with a greater degree of accountability is going to be really important. Likewise, if the whole transactional thing starts to take off, that's an example of a completely different set of metrics that will not only inform advertisers and others in a different way, it'll actually motivate the allocation of money in a completely different way. And, you know, for my money, that is going to grow forward, partly because retailers and brands are desperately looking for ways to compensate for the shortfall in sales at bricks and mortar stores where footfall is down. So I think that's going to upset the apple cart a little bit. And that has implications not only for measurement teams who have to get an expertise in that area, that's going to have implication for agencies as well. Because in order for agencies to remain relevant in this space, if you're going to find a heavily transactional component come into the area that has traditionally been theirs, then they're going to need to gear up their expertise in that space as well, which is about hiring a different kind of person, getting different skill sets in, and structuring the agencies slightly differently, not completely differently. But I think it's it's going to be a very interesting challenge in that respect.
Interesting. So this is a huge category for out of home for a lot of reasons. First of all, they spend a lot of money in our channel. You know, companies like Netflix and Amazon Prime have really leveraged out of home space to advertise. In fact, Netflix even acquired their own network of units out in California. So Netflix is now an out of home owner. But we also have screens and signage, you know, places where you can show video all over the country, and that penetration is growing. Do you see any opportunities for out of home as a channel to play in this game? What should we be thinking about? What should we be looking to incorporate into our offerings?
Yeah, I actually do. I think sort of nearer term, by which I mean over the next couple of years, there is going to be a lot of activity in terms of marketing to gain subscribers for different services. And there's more and more services not only coming to market, but also seeking to grow. And that actually not only applies to gaining subscribers, but it also means gaining users, because more and more services coming to the market, they're free. You don't need to subscribe, but they want you to download the app. Pluto's a great example. Fox has bought Tubi. We'll see what they're going to do with Tubi, but it's going to be their equivalent of Viacom's Play with Pluto. So there's going to be a lot of energy put into getting people aware of the platform's existence, what's on the platform, and content that you want to see on that platform. And, outdoor is ubiquitous, whether it's a dirty great billboard over a freeway or a throughway somewhere, or whether it's, as you say, the digital outdoor platforms at different parts of our communities. I think the digital platforms are actually very interesting because they provide an additional opportunity for effectively sampling. You can send the promos, you can send specific content that you might want to create ancillary content or secondary content that can be used for sampling purposes to particular locations. That would be a very, very interesting thing to see happen and experiment with. And you could put together really powerful, nuanced campaigns leading up to the period when a new season of something is going to be dropped on a streaming platform. Or think about stuff like Great British Baking Show. You've got these obsessive people like me who tune into that, and we're hugely frustrated by the fact I can now only watch one episode at a time unless I want to binge previous seasons. But I really want, that's going to be front of mind on a Friday night for me, which is kind of sad, but there you go. Where do they target messages when they're trying to push a show like that, which has a very particular following, but a fanatical and devoted following for something that people talk about? I think there's a lot of opportunities to get really creative like that. And the immediacy of the delivery of an out-of-home message and the contextual relevance, which is so much what it's all about, I think plays very well to creative thinking on the part of marketers and their agencies. Now, of course, that does depend on them being creative and thinking of the medium in that way, but that's your job. You get them thinking that way, and they will.
Great. Well, one more question for you. So speaking frankly, if you could put any message out on all those screens that we just spoke about to the community at large, what would it be?
Well, obviously, I'd put the transcript of our conversation up there and it would work brilliantly in the outdoor medium. Not. Okay. This is a really hard question. I love this question. And I love what Jane Clark came up with on a previous one of these. But it's really hard because if you don't actually have a product to sell or a service or whatever, you're starting with a blank slate. And, like we were talking about, the out-of-home medium provides so many opportunities, contexts, situational variables to take advantage of. You say, oh my God, what do I go with? So, well, I could do something that's about food because that's close to my heart in probably more ways than are healthy for me. I've got two, all right? I've got two that I can't make my mind up about. So, and they're both about voting because it seems vaguely appropriate to say something to encourage people to vote. Totally nonpartisan. One, and I see this working in interesting ways out of home. Relax, breathe, vote. Just bring some calmness to this. And that could be in white text on a black background or black text on a white background, or in digital, it could be cool because you could go relax, breathe, vote, and hold it. Not that I'm trying to influence creative here. The other one, playing into the power of content that we were talking about earlier and the resonance of content. Play with something familiar. I'm going to riff off a recognizable quote, one that's particularly recognizable to a certain section of community and a lot of young people. So we're going to go full Yoda here. We're going to say, there is no try, only vote.
Ah, love that.
So,
wonderful.
Those are my humble offerings.
That's fabulous, Mike. Thanks so much. Thanks for your time and your insights. I feel like we could have carried this conversation on for 3 hours, but that does not a good podcast make. So maybe we'll have to revisit in a few months and see what else is going on.
Sure. Love to. Thank you very much. This was great fun. Lovely to see you, of course, as always.
Always. Better over lunch, though, next time. So thank you all for joining. Speaking frankly, it was wonderful to have you listen to or watch our second episode. If you have any questions, you can reach us at geekout@geopath.org. And if it's about this podcast/webinar, use the subject line, Speaking Frankly Questions. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you all soon.